Sorry, before I start with my presentation, I'd like to start with a bit of an honesty test. So I want everybody to be as honest as possible. And I'd like you to put your hand up if you believe that climate change is one of the greatest challenges ever facing mankind. Okay, thank you. I'd like you to put your hand up, and I want you to be perfectly honest, if you think in your heart of hearts it's a scam to raise taxes. Not one. That's the first time I've ever done that. Not had one person going, well, actually. I want you to put your hand up if you're not sure. And I'd like you to put your hand up if you're not going to put your hand up no matter what question I ask. Of the people who are sure that they think that this is one of the greatest challenges facing mankind, how many of you could turn to the person to your left or right and explain to them the difference between weather and climate? Oh, we've got a couple. Excellent. Good. Well, it's an interesting thing because people are normally polarized. Everybody thinks they're an expert in climate change, yet very, very few people can actually explain that very simple difference. You'll have to excuse the crude nature of this graph. It's taken from the NASA website, and they haven't published their smooth high resolution one yet, but it shows the temperature variations across the whole globe from the end of the 19th century right up to modern day. That's 2009 up there. According to this measure, the second warmest year ever in recorded history. The red line is a 5-year average. The little green bars show you the error, margin of error. So even though I said that was the second warmest, you can see compared to some other recent years, it's hard to say statistically whether it is actually warmer or not. The wiggles are weather. And if you imagine just putting your fingers over a couple of years on that graph, you can't really see a trend. You can't really see whether it's going up or down. There's only very few places where you can actually get a trend within that. Climate is the long-term movement of those temperatures. The technical definition is that climate is 30 years of weather patterns. That line, as I say, is 5 years. The International Panel on Climate Change uses 20-year average to do their predictions. It's very interesting, those quite severe wiggles, and most of them come down to a thing called the El Nino Southern Oscillation in the Pacific. And if it's in what's called its El Nino phase, it's a warm year. So 2005, 1998, and certainly the second half of 2009 were all El Nino years. If it's in La Nina, the baby girl phase, it's cooling. So 2008, which you can see is cool here, that was a La Nina year. And that's the biggest effect on weather in the world. Carbon emissions have a very small effect on weather, but it's a persistent effect. So over years and years and years, it's causing that slow ramping up. And you've got that big mess of weather patterns over the top. And that's why people get confused about climate change. They say, how can we have had 4 weeks of snow here in the northeast if the world's getting warmer? Well, actually, that was bounced off by record temperatures in Australia. And if anybody opened the papers today, in Vancouver for the Winter Olympics, they just can't get enough snow. You've got slush. So you've got to take a global perspective, and you've got to take this long-term perspective. How do we know it's not a natural cycle? To work. This is a simplified version of that temperature pattern overlaid with the amount of energy coming from the sun. The two aren't on the same scale, but the yellow bit's the solar energy. And you can see at this point, about 1980, where the temperature started shooting upwards, the energy coming from the sun started going downwards. And that is the main variation which would cause an ice age or something like that. There's been a lot in the press about the Himalayan glaciers. Has everybody heard about this 2035 figure that got in by mistake? There's an assumption, because people say no, the glacier's not disappearing by 2035, that somehow the glaciers are all right. but they're not. This is a glacier on the side of Everest. This is it in the early 20s. This is it a couple of years ago. It's hard to get a scale because there's no people or buildings or anything in that. But that's 300 to 400 feet of ice has disappeared out of that valley. And those glaciers feed the headwaters of 7 of the biggest rivers in the world, like the Yangtze and the Indus, which in turn provide fresh water for 40% of the world's population. And even though the ice is still there, we're finding a mixture of flooding and drought in those areas, and the water quality is being affected as well, because the whole system is changing rapidly. If I show you another picture, this is Alaska. Again, start of the 20th century, start of the 21st century, all that ice has gone. The important thing about glaciers is they're storing water out of the sea. So if they melt, then sea levels tend to rise. And that's a very big scare. So people who say that the IPCC are alarmist by coming up with all these statistics, sea levels are rising faster than their predictions. So they're actually being conservative with most things. And that's why it was such a surprise that this 2035 date crept through. And to be honest, if that was true, if the Himalayan glaciers were going to disappear by 2035, we might as well just give up now. We wouldn't have a hope.